HOA tried to steal my grandfather's land for a golf course. Turns out they forgot one tiny detail. I'm not actually in their little kingdom. If you've ever wanted to watch entitled people dig their own graves with golden shovels, smash that like button. And drop a comment if you've ever received legal threats from people who clearly skipped basic geography in school. Let me paint you a picture. I'm Jake, 28, software developer who inherited my grandfather's 40-acre property in what used to be the middle of nowhere, Texas. Keywords, used to be. Over the past 5 years, McMansion developments sprouted around my land like expensive mushrooms after rain. And with them came the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, a collection of people who apparently had nothing better to do than measure grass height and argue about mailbox colors. My property sits right in the middle of their development like a stubborn tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. Grandfather's old farmhouse, a couple of barns, and acres of land that I use for, well, whatever I damn well please. Which, according to the HOA, was apparently a crime against suburban humanity. The first hint of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was sipping coffee on my porch, watching my neighbor's perfectly manicured lawn get its weekly professional treatment, when the mailman dropped off what looked like official correspondence. The envelope was so crisp and white it practically screamed, "I'm important, and you should be scared." Inside was a letter that made me do a genuine spit take. Coffee everywhere. Worth it. Final notice of unpaid HOA dues and pending foreclosure proceedings. I read it twice, then once more out loud to my dog, Rex, who seemed equally unimpressed. According to this masterpiece of legal fiction, I owed $47,000 in back dues, late fees, and property maintenance violations dating back 3 years. The letter, signed by one Margaret Maggie Henderson, HOA president and apparent delusion sufferer, informed me that I had 30 days to pay up or face foreclosure. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I do know basic property law. And I definitely know that you can't be in an HOA if you never agreed to be in an HOA. My grandfather bought this land in 1987, decades before anyone even dreamed of building cookie-cutter castles around it. But here's where it gets interesting. The letter mentioned that my property was essential for the completion of the Willowbrook Community Golf Course and Recreation Center. Oh, there it was. They didn't want my money, they wanted my land. I called the number on the letterhead, curious to see how deep this rabbit hole went. Willowbrook Estates HOA. This is Cindy. How can I make your day fantastic? The voice was so aggressively cheerful it could have powered a small city. Hi Cindy, this is Jake Morrison. I received a foreclosure notice, and I think there might be some confusion. Oh, Mr. Morrison, let me get Mrs. Henderson for you right away. Before I could object, I was subjected to hold music that sounded like elevator jazz had a baby with a dentist's waiting room. Then came the voice that would haunt my next few months. Mr. Morrison, this is Margaret Henderson. I trust you received our notice. Margaret had that particular tone that suburban middle management types perfect. Part kindergarten teacher, part prison warden. You know the one. I did, Mrs. Henderson. There's just one small problem. I'm not a member of your HOA. Silence. Then a laugh that could have stripped paint. Mr. Morrison, your property is entirely within our jurisdiction. The boundaries were established in 2019 when we expanded our authority to include all properties within a 2-mile radius of our main development. I blinked. I'm sorry. Did you just say you expanded your authority? Like some sort of suburban empire? We followed all proper legal procedures, Mr. Morrison. The county approved our petition. This was getting better by the minute. And did anyone think to inform the property owners who were being conscripted into your little kingdom? Notices were posted in the county record for 3 consecutive weeks. Failure to object constituted acceptance. Ah yes, the old, we buried the notice in a newspaper nobody reads and called it good routine. Classic. Mrs. Henderson, with all due respect, you can't just declare sovereignty over other people's land because they didn't read the fine print in the county record. This isn't risk. Her voice got that edge that suggested I was testing her patience. Mr. Morrison, whether you like it or not, your property is subject to our covenants and restrictions. Your rustic aesthetic is bringing down property values for the entire community. We've received numerous complaints. Rustic aesthetic? You mean my actual farm? We prefer to think of it as an opportunity for improvement. I was starting to understand what was happening here. These people had built their suburban paradise around my land, assuming they could pressure me into selling or force me out through their little bureaucracy. The foreclosure threat was just the nuclear option. After hanging up on Margaret's thinly veiled threats, I did what any reasonable person would do. I went full detective mode. If these people wanted to play legal games, I needed to understand the rules. First stop, the county courthouse. Now, I'd never been inside a courthouse that wasn't for jury duty, but apparently, property records are public domain. Who knew democracy could be so accessible? The clerk, a tired-looking woman named Beth who seemed genuinely apologetic about humanity in general, helped me pull the records for my property and the surrounding HOA development. "Honey," she said, spreading the documents across the counter. "This is either the biggest clerical error I've ever seen, or someone's trying to pull a fast one." She pointed to the HOA's boundary map, filed in 2019. Sure enough, there was my property, neatly encompassed in their jurisdiction like a fly in amber. But here's the kicker. The map showed my land as vacant agricultural property, ownership to be determined. "Beth," I said, "I've owned this land since 2018. My grandfather owned it for 30 years before that. How exactly is ownership to be determined?" She shrugged. "Someone filed this map without doing their homework. Or they did their homework and just didn't care." I requested copies of everything. The original HOA incorporation documents, the boundary expansion petition, the county approval process, and my personal favorite, the community improvement plan, that somehow included my property without my input. Reading through the documents that evening, the picture became crystal clear. The HOA hadn't just expanded their boundaries. They'd crafted a masterpiece of bureaucratic overreach. The community improvement plan was particularly enlightening. Phase 1. Establish HOA authority over all contiguous properties. Phase 2. Encourage property improvements through fines and violations. Phase 3. Acquire non-compliant properties through foreclosure for community enhancement projects. In plain English, steal land, build golf course, profit. The next morning brought a surprise visitor. I was replacing a fence post when a silver Mercedes pulled up my driveway. Out stepped Margaret Henderson in person, and she was exactly what I'd imagined. Perfectly styled blonde hair, designer athletic where that had never seen actual athletics, and that smile that said, "I'm about to ruin your day, but make it seem like your fault." "Mr. Morrison, what a lovely property you have here." She surveyed my land like a general planning an invasion. "I'm Margaret Henderson. I thought it might be helpful if we met face to face." Rex, bless his heart, took one look at her and started growling. Good judge of character, that dog. "Mrs. Henderson, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Well, I wanted to discuss your situation more, personally. You see, we're not the villains here. We're simply trying to maintain community standards." She gestured toward my barn, which admittedly had seen better decades. "This property has such potential. With the right improvements, it could really shine." "It's a working farm, Mrs. Henderson. It's supposed to look like a working farm." Of course. But you have to understand, our residents paid premium prices for homes in a maintained community. Your aesthetic choices affect their investment." I leaned against my fence post, enjoying the show. "Let me get this straight. You folks built houses around my farm, and now you're upset that it looks like a farm." Her smile tightened. "We're prepared to be reasonable, Mr. Morrison. The association has authorized me to make you a generous offer for your property." She handed me a folder. Inside was a purchase offer for $200,000. For 40 acres of land that was worth at least $800,000, probably more given the development pressure. "That's quite generous," I said deadpan. "Generous enough to make a person wonder if you know something about property values that the rest of the world doesn't. It's a fair offer considering the complications with the property." "You mean the complications you created by filing false boundary maps?" Her smile disappeared entirely. "Mr. Morrison, I'd advise you to take this offer seriously. The foreclosure process can be unpleasant and expensive. Mrs. Henderson, I'd advise you to check your property research before threatening to foreclose on land you don't have any legal claim to. She stood up, brushing imaginary dust off her designer workout clothes. You have 23 days, Mr. Morrison. I hope you make the right choice. After she left, I sat on my porch and laughed until my sides hurt. These people weren't just entitled, they were catastrophically overconfident. They built their entire scheme on the assumption that I was either too stupid or too poor to fight back. Time to prove them wrong. If Margaret thought I was going to roll over and play dead, she obviously hadn't done her research. I spent the next week reaching out to everyone who might have useful information about the HOA's little empire-building project. First call, my lawyer. Well, technically my grandfather's lawyer, but old Bill Hendricks had been handling our family's legal stuff for decades. He was semi-retired, spending most of his time fishing, but he still kept his license active for interesting cases. Jake, boy, he said over the phone, this is either the dumbest thing I've seen in 40 years of practice, or these folks are running some kind of long con. Which do you think it is, Bill? Oh, it's definitely the dumb thing. But that doesn't make them less dangerous. Stupid people with lawyers can cause a lot of damage before someone stops them. Bill agreed to take the case, mostly because, as he put it, I'm too old to let idiots get away with this nonsense. Next, I started talking to my actual neighbors, not the HOA development, but the other property owners who'd been around before suburbia invaded. Turns out, I wasn't the only one getting pressure from the Willowbrook Estates empire. Tom Bailey, who owned a small horse ranch 2 miles south, had been fighting violation notices for 6 months. According to the HOA, his horses were agricultural nuisances, and his barn was aesthetically incompatible with community standards. They want me to paint my 100-year-old barn to match their color scheme. Tom told me over beers at his kitchen table. Suggested I consider sage whisper or meadow mist. I told them where they could whisper their sage. Sarah Chun, who ran a small organic farm on the other side of the development, had an even better story. The HOA had tried to fine her for unauthorized agricultural activities, specifically growing vegetables for sale. They said my farm stand was operating without proper permits. She laughed. I've had the same permits for 8 years. But apparently, they don't count anymore because the HOA doesn't approve of commercial agriculture in their residential district. The pattern was becoming clear. The HOA was systematically targeting anyone who didn't fit their suburban cookie-cutter vision, using legal pressure to force compliance or acquisition. But here's where it got interesting. During my research, I discovered something the HOA had overlooked. Back in 2019, when they filed their boundary expansion, 3 property owners had actually objected in writing. The county was supposed to hold a hearing before approving the expansion. That hearing never happened. I found the objection letters buried in the county files. Tom, Sarah, and interestingly enough, someone named Robert Jenkins, who owned property right next to the planned golf course location. But there was no record of any public hearing, no notification to affected property owners, and no response to the objections. When I called the county planning office to ask about the missing hearing, I got transferred around like a hot potato before finally reaching someone who could help. Oh, said the planning coordinator, a guy named Dave who sounded genuinely confused. There should definitely have been a hearing. Let me look into this. 3 days later, Dave called back with news that made my week. Mr. Morrison, I've reviewed the file, and it appears the boundary expansion was approved in error. The hearing was never scheduled, and the objections were never addressed. Technically, the expansion is invalid. Beautiful. The HOA's entire legal foundation was built on a bureaucratic mistake. Meanwhile, Margaret and her crew were ramping up the pressure. I started getting daily violation notices for increasingly ridiculous infractions. My mailbox was non-compliant because it wasn't the approved model. My fence was too rustic for the community aesthetic. My dog was excessively agricultural, whatever that meant. Each violation came with a $200 fine and a threat that unpaid fines would be added to my outstanding HOA debt. The piece de resistance came when I received a violation notice for unauthorized wildlife habitat. Apparently, the pond my grandfather dug in 1995 was attracting ducks, and ducks were inconsistent with the residential character of the community. I framed that one. Pure comedy gold. But the HOA wasn't just escalating with paperwork. They were getting creative. I came home one afternoon to find a surveyor marking property lines, the wrong property lines. According to his map, my barn was 3 feet into HOA territory. "Excuse me," I called out to the surveyor. "What exactly are you measuring?" He looked uncomfortable, like a man who knew he was being paid to do something sketchy. "Just updating property boundaries, sir." Standard procedure. Standard procedure based on what? Because I've got the actual deed right here, and your measurements are off by about 50 feet. He packed up his equipment and left without another word. That evening, I got a call from Margaret. No more fake politeness. "Mr. Morrison, you're making this much more difficult than it needs to be." "Mrs. Henderson, I'm not making anything difficult. I'm just existing on my own property. Your property encroaches on association land. We have surveys to prove it." "You mean the surveys based on your illegally filed boundary maps? The ones that were approved without proper hearings?" Silence. "Then, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but the association's legal position is solid." "Is it?" "Because the county planning office seems to disagree." Another silence, longer this time. "Mr. Morrison, I strongly advise you not to make this personal." "Mrs. Henderson, you tried to steal my land. It doesn't get more personal than that." She hung up. I poured myself a beer and smiled. The war was officially on. After my little chat with Margaret, things got interesting fast. The HOA decided to abandon all pretense of legal procedure and go full nuclear. If they couldn't intimidate me with paperwork, they'd try everything short of actual warfare. It started with the inspections. Every morning for a week, I'd find different officials wandering around my property with clipboards, taking photos and measurements. Code enforcement, environmental inspectors, even someone claiming to be from the state agricultural department. All of them had the same vague explanation: routine compliance check. The agricultural inspector was my favorite. A nervous little man who clearly knew as much about farming as I knew about ballet. "Sir, we've received complaints about unauthorized crop cultivation." I gestured toward my vegetable garden. "You mean the tomatoes?" He consulted his clipboard. "Are these tomatoes licensed?" "Licensed. They're vegetables, not firearms." "Right, yes. But are they, regulation vegetables?" I had to give Margaret credit. She'd managed to find inspectors who were even more confused than her legal strategy. But the real masterpiece came when the HOA decided to solve their problem with infrastructure. One morning, I woke up to find a crew installing a gate across my driveway. Not at the property line, literally in the middle of my driveway, about 20 feet from my front door. The crew foreman, a guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, handed me an official-looking notice. "What's this?" I asked. "Security gate installation for Willowbrook Estates residents only. HOA approved." I read the notice. According to the document, my driveway was now considered private association roadway, and access required proper resident authorization. "You realize this is my driveway, right? On my property." The foreman shrugged. "Just doing what I'm paid to do, buddy." I called Bill Hendricks, who showed up an hour later looking like Christmas had come early. "Jake," he said, surveying the half-installed gate. "I've been practicing law for 4 decades, and I have never seen anything this beautifully illegal." The crew was still working when the sheriff's deputy arrived. Deputy Martinez looked at the situation, looked at my property deed, then looked at the HOA work order. "Ma'am," he said to the HOA representative who'd shown up, "you can't install gates on other people's property." The representative, a woman who introduced herself as the Community Compliance Coordinator, pulled out a folder full of maps. "This roadway is clearly within association boundaries." Deputy Martinez studied the maps, then studied my deed, then gave me a look that said, "These people are insane, but I have to handle this professionally." The property deed takes precedence over association maps. "This gate installation is trespassing. Cease work immediately." The crew packed up, leaving behind a half-installed gate that looked like modern art. I kept it as a conversation piece. But Margaret wasn't done. 2 days later, I discovered that someone had filed a complaint with the state environmental agency, claiming I was operating an illegal waste disposal facility. The evidence? My compost pile. The environmental inspector who showed up was a professional, unlike the agricultural comedian from earlier. She took one look at my compost bin and sighed. Mr. Morrison, this is clearly just garden compost. Whoever filed this complaint either doesn't know what compost is, or they're deliberately wasting my time. Which do you think it is? She smiled. In my experience, it's usually both. The harassment campaign hit its peak when someone called in a noise complaint about my agricultural machinery. The responding officer arrived to find me mowing my lawn with a perfectly ordinary riding mower at 2 in the afternoon. Mr. Morrison? Someone reported excessive machinery noise and possible zoning violations. I turned off the mower. Officer, it's a lawn mower. On a Tuesday afternoon. He looked around my property, taking in the obvious normalcy of everything. Sir, I think someone might be messing with you. You think? But here's where the HOA made their biggest mistake. In their eagerness to harass me into submission, they got sloppy. Each false complaint, each bogus inspection, each ridiculous violation notice created a paper trail. And that paper trail was building a beautiful case for harassment, abuse of process, and what Bill Hendricks cheerfully called actionable stupidity. Meanwhile, my coalition of wrong neighbors was growing. Word had spread about the HOA's tactics, and other property owners were coming forward with their own stories. The horse ranch owner, the organic farmer, and a dozen others who'd been targeted for not fitting the suburban mold. But the real game changer came when I got a call from an unexpected source. Is this Jake Morrison? This is Robert Jenkins. I understand you're having trouble with the Willowbrook HOA. Jenkins was one of the property owners who'd objected to the original boundary expansion. But unlike the others, he had inside information. Mr. Morrison, I used to work for the county planning office. I'm the one who processed the HOA's boundary application. And I can tell you, there were a lot of irregularities in how it was approved. We met the next day at a coffee shop in town, and Jenkins laid out the whole story. The HOA's expansion application had been fast-tracked through the approval process by someone with connections. The public hearing requirement had been waived through a technicality. The objection letters had been buried in the file and never reviewed. It's not technically illegal, Jenkins explained, but it's ethically questionable and procedurally flawed. The kind of thing that wouldn't survive a legal challenge. What would it take to challenge it? A lawyer, some money, and proof that proper procedures weren't followed, which I happen to have. Jenkins pulled out a folder full of documents, internal memos, email chains, and procedural guidelines that showed exactly how the HOA had manipulated the system. Why didn't you fight this 3 years ago? I asked. He smiled grimly. Because I sold my property and moved to Arizona. But watching them try to steal your land? That's a bridge too far. With Jenkins' evidence and Bill's legal expertise, we filed a motion to invalidate the HOA's boundary expansion on procedural grounds. But we didn't stop there. We also filed complaints for harassment, abuse of process, and fraudulent property claims. Margaret's response was swift and predictable. She called an emergency HOA meeting and sent me a formal invitation to attend and present my case to the community. The invitation was beautifully condescending. We believe that open dialogue and community engagement can resolve this misunderstanding. I RSVP'd immediately. This was going to be fun. The Willowbrook Estates Community Center was exactly what you'd expect. All beige walls, motivational posters about community spirit, and the kind of fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look like they're dying. Perfect setting for what was about to unfold. I arrived fashionably on time to find about 50 residents packed into folding chairs, buzzing with the kind of excitement usually reserved for public executions. Margaret sat at the front table looking like a general preparing for battle, flanked by the HOA board and their lawyer, a guy in an expensive suit who kept checking his watch like he had somewhere better to be. Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret began. We're here tonight to address the situation with Mr. Morrison's property. She said situation, the way most people say sewage backup. As you know, Mr. Morrison has refused to comply with community standards and has been disruptive to our peaceful neighborhood environment. A few murmurs of agreement from the crowd. These people had clearly been primed. However, we believe in community dialogue and giving everyone a chance to be heard. Mr. Morrison, would you like to present your perspective? She gestured to a chair facing the crowd like I was about to confess my crimes. I stood up instead. Thanks, Margaret. I appreciate the opportunity to clear up a few misunderstandings. I pulled out my folder of documents, property deeds, county records, and all the evidence Jenkins had provided. First, let me address the elephant in the room. I'm not a member of your HOA. I never agreed to be a member of your HOA. And according to county records, your HOA doesn't actually have legal authority over my property. The murmuring got louder. Margaret's smile tightened. Mr. Morrison, the legal boundaries are clearly established. Are they? Because I have here the original county approval documents for your boundary expansion, and it turns out that approval was invalid. No public hearing was held, objections were ignored, and proper procedure wasn't followed. I held up Jenkins' documentation. I also have internal county memos showing how your expansion was fast-tracked without proper review. Margaret's lawyer whispered something in her ear. She nodded and stood up. Mr. Morrison, even if there were minor procedural issues with the original filing, you've been operating under HOA jurisdiction for 3 years. That constitutes acceptance. Actually, Margaret, that constitutes fraud. And speaking of fraud, let's talk about your foreclosure threat. I pulled out another document. This is my property deed. Notice the part where it shows I own my land free and clear, with no liens, no outstanding debts, and no obligations to any homeowners association. The crowd was getting restless now. A few people were starting to look uncomfortable. But here's my favorite part. I continued. The foreclosure notice I received mentioned that my property was essential for the completion of the Willowbrook Community Golf Course. I let that hang in the air for a moment. Funny thing about that golf course. According to the development plans I found at the county office, it's supposed to be built on what's currently my land. The land you're trying to foreclose on. More murmuring, this time with a different tone. People were starting to connect the dots. So let me get this straight, I said, addressing the crowd now instead of Margaret. Your HOA board tried to illegally expand their authority to include my property, then manufactured fake violations to justify foreclosure. Also, they could seize my land for a golf course that would benefit the community. A woman in the third row raised her hand. Is that true? Are you building a golf course on his property? Margaret looked like she'd swallowed a golf ball. The community improvement plan includes various recreational facilities. That's not what I asked, the woman said. Are you trying to take his land for a golf course? The lawyer leaned over and whispered urgently in Margaret's ear. She shook her head. The association has made a generous offer to purchase Mr. Morrison's property at fair market value. $200,000 for 40 acres, I interrupted. When comparable land in this area sells for $20,000 per acre. That's not generous, Margaret. That's theft with paperwork. Now the crowd was really buzzing. I could see people doing math in their heads. A man near the back stood up. Wait a minute. If they're willing to pay $800,000 for that land, what's it really worth? And why are our HOA fees going toward buying land for a golf course nobody asked for? Margaret was starting to look like a deer in headlights. The board has full authority to make community improvement decisions. Based on what? Another voice called out. When did we vote on a golf course? Or vote to raise fees to pay for land acquisition? Or vote to foreclose on people who aren't even HOA members? The meeting was rapidly spiraling out of Margaret's control. People were standing up, talking over each other, demanding answers about HOA finances and decision-making processes. But I wasn't done yet. Actually, folks, there's one more thing you should know. Over the past month, your HOA has filed false complaints with multiple government agencies, attempted to install gates on my private property, and conducted what amounts to a harassment campaign to try to force me off my land. I pulled out photos from my phone, showing the attempted gate installation and the various inspectors who'd been wandering around my property. They've also been less than honest with you about their legal position. The county planning office has confirmed that their boundary expansion was improperly approved, which means every violation, every fine, and every legal action they've taken against non-consenting property owners has been based on invalid authority. Margaret finally found her voice. "Mr. Morrison, you're disrupting a community meeting with inflammatory accusations." "Margaret, I'm exposing fraud with documented evidence." "There's a difference." The lawyer was now frantically scribbling notes and looking like he wanted to crawl under the table. "Smart man. So here's what's going to happen," I continued, addressing the crowd. "Tomorrow morning, my lawyer is filing a lawsuit to invalidate your HOA's boundary expansion and seek damages for harassment and abuse of process. We're also filing complaints with the State Attorney General's office about fraudulent property claims and misuse of HOA funds." The room erupted. People were shouting questions at the board, demanding financial records, and generally causing the kind of chaos that makes democracy beautiful. Margaret tried to restore order by banging a gavel, but nobody was listening anymore. I gathered my papers and headed for the door, but stopped for one final observation. "Oh, and Margaret, that foreclosure deadline you gave me? It expired yesterday. I'm still here, still on my own land, still not a member of your little kingdom." I walked out to the sound of 50 voices demanding answers and one very uncomfortable board trying to explain the unexplainable. 3 weeks later, the lawsuit was settled out of court. The HOA agreed to invalidate all claims against my property, pay my legal fees, and compensate me for harassment and damages. The golf course project was quietly canceled, and Margaret Henderson resigned from the board to pursue other opportunities. I used the settlement money to buy a new tractor and install a really nice fence on my actual property line, properly surveyed by a legitimate company. The fence has a beautiful gate with a sign that reads, "Private property, no HOA nonsense beyond this point." Rex loves it. And sometimes, when I'm working in my garden, I can see Margaret's former neighbors walking by and giving me approving nods. Turns out, once people figured out what their HOA board was really up to, they weren't too happy about it either. As for Margaret herself, last I heard, she moved to a different state to start fresh, probably looking for a new community to improve with her special brand of suburban tyranny. I almost feel bad for her new neighbors. Almost. Thank you for being with us. Please share in the comments where you are watching from and whether you liked everything, and see you next time.